Sometimes it's easy to miss God's grace. Sometimes it's easy to miss the way that God moves. Sometimes it's easy to miss the way that God perceives us or pursues us. Sometimes it's easy to forget or to miss God's grace. I was challenged with that as I was reading Exodus chapter 3 this morning. Exodus chapter 3 is such an interesting passage. You know, this is after Moses was born, and the edict to kill all the children was overcome by putting him into the Nile, and then he was pulled up, and he's raised by Pharaoh's daughter, and now Moses has actually run away from Egypt. He has married, as he's into Midian, he marries. He is now tending to the flock of his father-in-law, and he's walking in the desert. When he comes up on this bush that is burning, but it doesn't burn up. As a matter of fact, verse 2 says, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush." Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it didn't burn up. You see, bushes being on fire in the desert is not exactly abnormal. I mean, the dryness and the heat. And so he'd seen a bush burning before, but the fact that it wasn't burning up, it just kept burning and burning and burning, caught his attention. So he says, I'll go over, verse 3, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush doesn't burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." You know, it's interesting to me because I've had quite a few people that have said to me over the years, I just wish God would speak to me in a burning bush. I wish God would just tell me his will. I wish God would just reveal to me what he desires. I wish he would just talk to me in a burning bush like he did to Moses. And one of the things that's interesting to me is I'm going, you do know, right, that Moses was wandering in the desert for decades before he saw a burning bush. You do know that Moses was basically in exile. He was a running fugitive for murdering an Egyptian. And for years, decades, he is in the wilderness before he sees a burning bush. Listen, if you want God to speak to you in a burning bush, don't be surprised if it comes in decade after decades of wandering in your own desert. I would much rather just live day to day with the Holy Spirit than to have a burning bush experience, but I digress. "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. This whole encounter, it would be easy to assume that God's grace is found in the appearance in the burning bush. That whenever God appears in the burning bush, it is this unique moment of intimacy. It's this unique moment of grace. But I think that if we just summarized this text as that moment being the key moment of grace, we actually would miss where the grace resides. Let's keep going. God looks at Moses and he says in verses 7 through 10, he says, "Listen, I have heard the cries in Israel. I know the suffering and the slavery they've been going through. They've been under the bondage of Egypt, and I have heard their cries. And it's now time to move. It's now time to not just free them from the oppression of Egypt, but to actually lead them into a promised land that is flowing with milk and honey," it says in verse 8. Verse 11, verse 10, God says, "So Moses, now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." And in verse 11, Moses objects. He says, whoa, who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Now, he's kind of trying to blame himself, like, I'm not worthy. But in reality, Moses is going, I don't want to do this. And God says, no, it's okay, I'll be with you. Verse 12. "And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." And then Moses objects again. Verse 13. "Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, well, what's his name? Then what name should I tell him?" This is the second time that Moses says to God, "You've got the wrong guy. Don't send me. Don't send me. I'm afraid of you. I just don't want to obey you." How often do we do that? You know, I mean, some of us, we talk about and we even kick other people into hell pretty flippantly. And we have this relationship with God that is based off of fear. But how often do we allow God's grace to move us into obedience? Moses hides his face into the sand. But God tells him to go, "I'll be with you." And Moses says, that's not enough. Now, maybe the action of grace, some people would say, no, it's not the burning bush. It's the fact that God doesn't smite Moses on the spot. You know, that may be true. But I actually think that there's a unique moment of grace that happens in the very next verse. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you." Here's what's crazy. Moses gives these, in some sense, unreasonable demands to God. "I will obey you if." And yet we see God respond. And I find that to be gracious, but I find it even more gracious that when Moses asks for a name, God limits his infiniteness in an actual word, in a name. God's name, I am, or in Greek, ego eimi. God in his infinite glory can never, in his boundless majesty, could never be limited. His very nature is limitlessness. And yet, in his pursuit of us, in his desire to draw closer to us, in his desire to take care of us, he allows himself to be limited in a name. This is the reason why I think that Paul says, under heaven there is no name like Jesus Christ. This name, it confounds the greatest of theologians. This name contains mysteries that are unfathomable. This name is absurd, not just because it is the name that frightens away demons, or it is the name that has been hidden since the foundations of the earth, only revealed to us in this time. No, it is absurd because the limitless God has chosen to allow language to limit him enough so that we can engage him. I cannot believe, I'm overwhelmed by the thought of the love of God that consistently looks for ways to limit himself just so that him and I can be closer, so that we can be one. It's easy to overlook moments of grace. But this week I want to challenge you by reflecting on the grace that is contained in the name of God, Yahweh, Emmanuel, Jesus. Love you guys. Talk to you next week.